Hey everybody, Dave here, and today I want to talk about a few of the things that people migrating from 5e over to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, specifically Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remastered, may want to know when they come to that table for the first time. I've noticed a bit of an influx of people coming over to the game from 5e lately, and in my own game, I believe every single one of my players also plays in a different 5e game. So sometimes they come to the table and get a little confused on what rules are and how things work. And for people coming over from 5e, I know a familiar experience is you have a friend who's running a Pathfinder game and they say, hey, come over and play with us some night. And that 5e player says, well, I really don't want to have to learn a new system. So their friend says, don't worry about it. If you know how to play 5e, you know how to play Pathfinder. It's the same thing. And then that person shows up at the Pathfinder game only to realize that it's the same except for this, and so on. So that's what this video is going to try to tackle. I am going to go over a number of the tripping points that I've seen at my table for 5e players coming into Pathfinder, and this is a pretty long list. So first things, it's not going to be all-inclusive of all the changes. I'm not going to go into specific differences between classes. This is all going to be general, and a lot of rules have exceptions, which I won't be going into each and every exception either, but this should give you a really good idea of the key things that you might want to know when making that conversion from D&D 5e over to Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remastered. And if you're new to Pathfinder, you're probably new to this channel. So I guess first of all, just let me say, welcome on behalf of the Pathfinder community. Welcome to our side of the tabletop RPG space, and welcome to this channel. I create rules instruction videos, and one of the reasons why I'm not going to go into all the detail of the things I'm going to be talking about today is because odds are I probably have a more detailed video that goes into these things. And so if you're not clear on something that I say or share in this video, check out the comments section. I'll have a pinned to the top of it a list of other videos that you can click on to get more information. So with that all set up, let's go ahead and dive in. And the first thing I think 5e players need to know about Pathfinder 2nd Edition is the trait system. And you are going to want to know your traits. So in 5e, I believe for gear, for your weapons, there's a table, and I think they're called properties in D&D 5e. Same idea in Pathfinder. Each weapon's going to have a set column on the big table that shows their traits. We call them traits. But the reason why I bring this up is in Pathfinder, this goes well beyond just your gear. Traits are used in every action, every feat, every spell, every saving throw you're going to roll, every poison, everything uses traits. And these traits are great because they save a lot of print space in the books, because if you know how a trait works, you don't have to repeat the text for that piece in every single thing it applies to. But a lot of these traits really kind of modify the way things work in the game. So especially if you're a spellcaster, make sure you look up what the traits for that spell actually mean and do before you cast that spell. If you are going to cast a spell and it has the incapacitate trait, make sure you look up incapacitate and know how that's going to alter or change the expected effects of that spell. And the places you can go to look up these traits vary a little bit. Officially, you can go into the indexes of the books and look up those traits to find the information. If you're playing at a table that has, any kind of digital setup, use your phone, use an iPad, whatever. You can go to the Archive of Nethys, which is the official Pathfinder online rules repository, and search for the traits there. Another place you could go to is PF Easy. PF Easy Tools is a similar um, web-based index of all the different rules and whatnot, and that's another place you can go to quickly search for these traits. Another thing I want to talk about is going to be how success and failure works in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So in Pathfinder, there are 4 degrees of success, which are going to be very familiar to D&D players. You got your critical success, your regular failure, and your critical failure. But what may be different is those 4 degrees of success apply to pretty much everything. Pretty much every skill you use is going to have these 4 degrees of success. So yes, you can critically succeed on your skills and critically fail at your skills as well. Anytime you roll a saving throw, there are going to be those same 4 degrees of success. So you can critically succeed and critically fail on your saving throws. And one of the main reasons why you should understand that is because the way you determine if your action is a critical success or a critical failure is a little bit different in Pathfinder than it is in D&D 5e. So you may be accustomed to every time you roll a natural 20 on the die, critical hit, critical success. Every time you roll a natural 1, critical failure, critical miss, however you want to put that. But in Pathfinder, there is one more very important way that you can score a critical success or a critical failure, and that is by hitting a DC that is 10 higher or 10 lower than the regular DC. So for example, if you're trying to hit a DC 15, you roll a natural 19, but your modified total is a 25. That's 10 more than the target DC, so that's a critical hit or a critical success if you're doing a skill or and whatnot. And the same is true for failures. If you don't roll a natural 1, maybe you roll a natural 2 or a natural 3, and your final total is 10 below what the target number is, you get a critical failure. So this is great, not just in the sense of it gives you more ways to critically succeed and critical fail, but it also makes every +1 or -1 on any roll much more significant, because you're not just increasing your odds of success, you're increasing your odds of critical succeeding, and you're decreasing your odds of having a critical failure. So that makes every little bonus you can get a little more important and potent. Also, something to be aware of here is that just because you roll a natural 20 does not guarantee a critical success or a critical hit. And vice versa, just because you roll a natural 1 does not necessarily mean a critical failure. What happens when you roll a natural 20 is you add your bonus to it, and you compare that bonus, that final total, to the target number, and then you increase it by 1 degree of success. So say you're trying to hit a target number of 25. You roll a natural 20, and you've got a +9 as a bonus that you're applying to this. 20 plus 9 is 29. So 29 versus a target number of 25, that would be a normal success normally, but because you rolled a natural 20, you increase it 1 step to a critical success. But if the target number was, say, 30, and you rolled a natural 20, and you add your +9 bonus to a 29, that would normally be a failure. But because you rolled a natural 20, it increases it 1 step from failure to a regular success, not a critical success. So this does add a little more complexity to I guess the math of your critical successes and critical failures. To be completely transparent and honest, as long as you're in the ballpark for what you're attempting to do, if you're fighting similarly leveled enemies, this is not going to be an issue. A natural 20 should typically be at least a regular success and not a failure for whatever you're doing. So it's very infrequent that this comes up. But it can possibly come up, especially if you are in a situation where you're engaging with people who are enemies that are way overleveled or way underleveled. Or if you're attempting to use a skill that you have no training in or minimal training in to do something very difficult, this could come up as well. But just know, by the rules as written, a 20 is not always a critical success, and a 1 is not always a critical failure. Another thing to talk about is how we calculate critical damage. So when you do roll that critical success, a critical hit, the way you calculate your damage in Pathfinder is you roll your damage and you multiply that final damage by 2. And right now, I'm sure there are 5e players out there saying, "What are you talking about, Dave? That's no different than D&D. D&D, you get your double damage on a critical hit." But it is a little different, because in Pathfinder, what you do is you just pretend you didn't roll a critical success. Just pretend you didn't roll a critical success. Roll it like it was a regular success, and then double it. So what that means is those static bonuses, your strength bonus, that gets doubled too. If you're a rogue and you're sneak attacking somebody, that sneak attack damage gets doubled too. You just pretend you didn't roll a critical success. You roll the damage, add everything together. Sneak attack damage, precision damage. If you have a flaming sword, the flaming 1d6 extra flaming damage, you add that. Your static bonuses, everything you add together, and then you multiply it by 2. As opposed to the way I believe 5e works, where you don't get to double that strength bonus, that static damage. You don't get to double some other things. In Pathfinder, like I said, pretend you did not roll a critical success, roll it as normal, and multiply it by 2. Now, at the beginning of this video, I said that I wasn't going to go into every exception, but this is an area that I will go into a little bit of an exception. And that exception is if there's any effect or modifier that specifically only occurs on a critical hit. If you are casting a spell, it might give you special text for what happens on a critical success or a critical hit, and you're going to follow that rule as opposed to the more general rule of you just roll it like normal and multiply by 2. Also, there are certain weapon traits, like I mentioned before, know your traits. There are 2 traits to know, and those are deadly and fatal. The deadly and fatal traits that belong to weapons modify how they function when they deliver critical hits. So if you're using a weapon that has one of those 2 traits, you're going to want to make sure that you read those traits and understand how they modify this. The good news is going to, in both those cases, is going to increase the damage. But if you don't have a weapon that has one of these traits, like deadly or fatal, the general rule of thumb is going to work in most cases. Pretend you did not roll a critical hit. Just roll it normal, add everything together, multiply it by 2. So, while we're still talking about our checks and our 4 degrees of success and whatnot, we should probably talk a little bit about DCs, or difficulty classes. One of the things that often comes up in my games from 5e players coming over to the table is I might ask them for a specific DC, and I might ask a player, "What is your perception DC?" And that player looks all over their sheet, and they say, I don't see perception DC listed anywhere. Whenever a GM asks you what a DC is, find the corresponding skill or saving throw or whatever, and just add 10. So if you have a +8 bonus to perception, and your GM asks you what's your perception DC, you just add 10 to it. A +8 bonus becomes a perception DC of 18. If you have a +12 bonus to stealth, your stealth DC is 22. If you have a +6 reflex saving throw bonus, then your reflex DC is going to be 16. Anytime your GM asks you what a DC is, find the corresponding ability and just add 10 to it. It's that easy. Also, talking about our DCs and our skills, you might be interested to know that there are no opposed rolls in Pathfinder, with one possible little asterisk, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So what this means is you might be accustomed to, if you're a rogue and you're trying to sneak past a guard, you would roll your stealth skill. The DM would roll the perception check for that guard, and then whoever has the highest wins. That's not the way it works in Pathfinder. In Pathfinder, whoever is performing the action rolls the dice, and you compare it to the static DC of the other party. So if you're a player, you're a rogue, you're trying to sneak past a guard, you would roll 1d20, add your stealth score. That's what you're rolling for your sneaking past this guard. That is compared to that guard's perception DC. Kind of like passive perception, although we don't use that term in this game, and it's probably best that you not even think of it that way. But whatever their perception bonus is, you add 10 to it. That's the target number that the rogue needs to beat in order to sneak past them. On that guard's turn, if they want to spend one of their actions to actively search the area for any intruders, then they would roll 1d20 and add their perception bonus because they're the active character in that point in time, and that would be compared to the stealth DC of the sneaking player. They would not roll their stealth score again, nor would they use the total of the stealth score that they rolled the previous round. It's going to be our DCs are what all of the active rolls are compared to. No opposed rolls. Another thing to consider is going to be how saving throws work. Well, first of all, saving throws this is old school, goes back to like 3rd and maybe even 4th edition D&D. There's only 3 saving throws, reflex, fortitude, and will, as opposed to being 1 for all 6 of the different ability scores. That's not going to be too hard for you to wrap your heads around, I imagine. But you're going to see text that says, roll a, quote, basic saving throw. And this is most common in spells. And this is like traits. This is an area where they're using a little bit of a shorthand to prevent having to retype the exact same information 100 times for 100 different spells. But what you need to know when you see a basic saving throw is all that means is you roll your saving throw, and if you get a critical success, you suffer no damage. If you roll a regular success, you suffer half damage. If you roll a regular failure, you suffer the full damage. And on a critical failure, you suffer double damage. So you're only going to see the words basic saving throw applied to effects that deal damage. And that's all it means, is it will say roll a basic, if you look at a fireball, it's going to tell you to roll a basic reflex saving throw versus an amount of damage. And they're not going to spend page space telling you that on a critical success you suffer no damage, on a regular success you suffer half damage, on a regular failure you suffer normal damage, and on a critical failure you suffer double damage. They're just going to make that stat block real small and concise. Know that when you see that word basic, that's what it means. Also, don't assume that a damaging effect follows those rules. If it says to make a reflex save and does not say basic, then you do not apply that staggered process. You would just apply whatever the effect listed in the description of that spell or other ability would be. Alright, so now let's move on to the action economy. This is one of the major features of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I think most people view this more favorably than in 5e, but basically you are given 3 actions on your turn, and 1 reaction that you can spend during someone else's turn, including during an enemy's turn. But your 3 actions during your turn can be used for basically anything. So that means if you want to attack somebody, that's going to be one of your actions. If you want to move at your speed score, that's going to be another action. If you want to take any other actions, then there's likely going to be a number of arrows at the top of that action's description, and those arrows tell you how many actions you have to spend to do the thing. So, for example, most spells are going to have two little arrows at the top, which means it costs 2 actions to cast that spell. And so this gives you a lot of flexibility in how you can operate on every turn. But there are some particular things I want to make sure I cover here. First is multiple attacks. So yes, you got 3 actions a turn. If you start your turn standing adjacent to your enemy, you can spend all 3 of your actions to make 3 attacks. But there is what's known as the multiple attack penalty, which just means every attack after the first is going to suffer a penalty. So your first attack every turn, whether it's your first action of that turn or your last, can be made with no penalty at all. Your second attack in a turn is going to suffer a -5 multiple attack penalty, and your third and possibly fourth and future attacks at turn will all be made at -10. So yes, you can attack 3 times per turn. Just make sure that that second attack you're suffering a -5, and that third attack you're suffering a -10. The key exception to this is, again, know your traits. Some weapons have the agile trait. So these are typically light weapons like a dagger. And the agile trait reduces that multiple attack penalty from the second attack being -5 to only being -4, and your third attack and all future attacks from being -10 to being -8. Generally speaking, it's not a great idea, statistically speaking, to attack 3 times at -10 or even -8 penalty is pretty harsh. So you might want to think about other things to do with that third action. The most frequent things would be raising your shield. Important thing to know in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, just having a shield strapped to your arm does not give you a bonus to your armor class. You must spend an action to raise that shield in order to receive that bonus. So, if you attack twice, you don't want to suffer a -10 to that third attack. I'm going to spend that third action to raise my shield. You can also use that third action to perform recall knowledge. See what you know about this enemy. Do you know any of its weaknesses that you might be able to exploit? That actually might be something that you do with your first action, so that you might be able to exploit that weakness with your second action, which would be your attack. Another thing you might want to do with that third action is to move away from your enemy. So we should talk a little bit about how attacks of opportunity, or what I believe in 5th Ed is called opportunity attacks, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remastered, these are now called reactive strikes. But it's basically the idea. If your enemy moves away from you, you get a sucker punch him, you get a free attack on him. So the first thing to know about opportunity attacks, or what we call reactive strikes, is that not everybody has them. In fact, they are fairly rare, especially in the early levels. Fighters get them by default. All fighters will have them. Other martial classes can typically choose them with one of their feats as they level up. And some monsters that you might expect to have that kind of martial prowess have them. But not everybody has them. And this is a wonderful thing, because what this does is it really opens up that entire map for you to use in a fight. My experience with 5e and earlier games like 3e has been that you get into melee combat and people get rooted. They just stand still and just bludgeon each other until somebody dies, because nobody wants to move away and risk triggering that opportunity attack or reactive strike. But in Pathfinder, they're fairly rare. So that means you shouldn't be afraid to move away from most enemies. If you're fighting somebody who seems like they are a fighter by class, you can pretty much expect they're going to have opportunity attacks or reactive strikes. Everybody else, you might want to test it out, try a gamble, whatever. But this really opens up the entire map for you to move around and not feel rooted in place. Also be aware that in 5e, I believe opportunity attacks are triggered when you move away from your opponent. So in 5e, you can circle around your opponent as long as you remain within their threatened area, the reach of their weapon. That's not the way it works in Pathfinder. By Raw, if you leave a square that is threatened by an opponent, and that opponent has reactive strike, that can trigger it. Also, be aware that other classes have other things that can trigger, like an opportunity attack when you move away from them. That function a little differently. I believe barbarians have an ability that let them follow you. So when you try to move away from them, that triggers their reaction, that they can have a free stride, that they just stay pace with you, so you can't escape them. And monks have an ability called Stand Still, that when you try to leave your space and get away from them, they get a free attack to try to trip you and knock you down. So just be aware that there are other reactions that can trigger. But generally speaking, what you need to know, not everybody can do opportunity attacks. Another thing to know about movement, and this is a little bit of a point of contention that a lot of my 5e players don't like, but I think they warm up to once they kind of understand how this action economy works. And that is, in Pathfinder, you cannot split your movement. So you may be used to, if you can move 30 feet in a turn, you can move 15 feet, attack somebody, move 15 more feet. In Pathfinder, it takes one action for you to stride up to your speed, and then would be a second action to attack. And then if you wanted to move again, you'd have to spend your third attack, even if you didn't use all of your speed on your first attack. And a lot of 5e players don't like this. Generally speaking, I think it's a bit of a wash, because in Pathfinder we have 3 actions that we can spend on anything. And so in DnD, you're used to moving 15 feet, attacking, and moving 15 more feet. In D&D, you can still do, in Pathfinder, you can still do that. You can still move, attack, and move in your turn. It's just you spend your first action to move, your second action to attack, and your third action to move again. And I understand that bonus actions and some other things may modify how that works, and that's the same in Pathfinder. We don't have bonus actions, but we do have other feats and things that might modify this. But long story short, what you need to know, you cannot split your actions. So there is one very big exception to this. In the GM core rulebook, it does empower the game master to make sort of common sense adaptations to this. So say you're standing 5 feet away from a wall you want to climb. By Raw, you spend your first action to move 5 feet, your second action to climb that wall, and then your third action either to keep climbing or do something at the top or whatever. The GM core rulebook does say that game masters don't get too silly with this. If you want to, you can include the 5 feet of that movement in your climbing, and not make it cost 2 actions. Do not make someone with a speed score of 35 feet have to spend an action to only step 5 feet. So, but generally speaking, you cannot split your movement. GMs know that you are empowered to play with that, however makes sense in your games. Let's see, what next is on the list? Oh, I talked a little bit earlier about how spells typically cost 2 actions, but I do want to talk about some spells that cost either 3 actions or 1 action. Typically, anytime you summon a creature, your summon animal spells, summon dragon, summon plant, all your summon abilities, those are going to cost 3 actions, and typically be your entire turn to summon that extra creature onto the field. Other spells, most notably the heal spell, you can cast it with only 1 action. And when you do it that way, you have a range of touch with your healing spell. So you can either heal yourself or someone adjacent to you for only 1 action. For 2 actions, it becomes a ranged healing spell and heals a little more. And if you cast that spell with 3 actions, it becomes an emanation and you heal everybody around you in that emanation. And that's all for 1 spell slot. This doesn't alter how your spell slots are spent. It only alters the number of actions you have to use to cast the spell and the effects. The more actions you spend, the more benefit you get. Um, but that only applies to spells like heal that specifically call that out. Talking about spellcasting, this is another area that 5e players often find a little confusing. Pathfinder 2nd Edition uses old school Vancian spellcasting rules for their prepared spellcasters. All of our spellcasters fall into the category of either being prepared spellcasters or spontaneous spellcasters. So this mostly is going to apply, or entirely apply, to our prepared spellcasters. So typically we're talking about our wizards and our clerics and a few others, but those are the two major ones. As a prepared spellcaster, in the morning, as part of your daily preparations, you pick every spell slot and you assign a specific spell to that slot. So when you prepare in the beginning of the day, you set in stone, I have these spells, and for this specific spell slot, I can only cast this spell at this level, and so on and so on and so on. And so you don't have as much flexibility, whereas like in 5e, you prepare a number of spells from your spell book, but you have flexibility in casting those spells throughout your day. That's not the way it works in Pathfinder. If you're a prepared spellcaster, at the beginning of the day, you more or less etch in stone how you're going to spend each spell slot and what the corresponding spell will be. There are exceptions to that. There are ways wizards can swap a spell or modify how that works. I'm not getting into all those exceptions. The key thing to know, prepared spellcasters, at the beginning of the day, you prepare your spells and you're locked in to those specific spells. So that means if you don't prepare to cast fly multiple times, you can't cast it multiple times. You're locked in. A lot of people coming over from 5e do not like this. They want the freedom they had in 5e. And the great news is there is an archetype called flexible preparation. You can find it in the book Secrets of Magic. You can also find it on Archives of Nephthys or Easy Tools or any of those other online platforms. And I think this is an optional archetype, so you'll have to get permission from your GMs to use it. But if you are a prepared spellcaster and you take the flexible preparation archetype, it more or less makes those classes function exactly the way you're used to them functioning in 5th edition. The downside is you have one fewer spell per level you can cast per day. But the benefit is you have a whole lot more freedom of choice in how you spend your spell slots. And keeping on with our discussion of spells, let's talk about concentration spells. In 5e, you are used to only being able to cast one concentration spell at a time. And you may go through the Pathfinder rulebook, the player's core book, look through the spells and you notice, like I told you, remember those traits, those tags at the top of these things. And you'll see different spells that have the concentrate trait or tag assigned to them. And your natural assumption is that means I can only, if I have multiple spells that have the concentrate trait, I can only keep one of these running at a time. That is not what that means in Pathfinder. In fact, for the moment, let's ignore the concentrate trait altogether. Those spells that you're used to, where you can keep them persisting turn after turn after turn, as long as you're able to concentrate on them, in Pathfinder, we call those sustain spells. So if you see a spell that has a duration listed as sustain, what that means is every turn after the first, you have to spend one action to sustain that spell. You spend an action, and it extends the duration of that spell for one round. So on your next turn, if you want to keep that spell's effect going, you have to spend one action to sustain it again. and so on and so on and so on until you either decide not to sustain it anymore or until you're knocked unconscious or whatever and can't act to sustain it. The key thing to know here is that there is no limit to that. No limit in the sense of you can only concentrate on one spell at a time. You have 3 actions per turn. If you wanted to, you could sustain 3 sustained spells at a time. It would be difficult to get 3 sustained spells cast, but mathematically it's possible that you could have 3 sustained spells active and spend your 3 actions to sustain them every turn to keep all 3 of them going. You wouldn't be able to do anything else that turn. So when you're used to having that limitation of 1 concentration spell going, just know that in Pathfinder we call those sustain spells, and you'll look for the duration of sustain, and just know 1 action to keep those going turn after turn. So what does that mean when we see the concentrate trait or tag applied to these? If we don't have to concentrate to keep them going, what does that concentrate tag or trait mean? In and of itself, that trait doesn't mean anything. What that is there for is for other effects to interact with the ability. So for example, if you're a barbarian and you're raging, you cannot use any action that has the concentrate trait because you're so full of rage and anger you can't concentrate. So if you were a barbarian who could cast spells, you cannot cast any spell with the concentrate trait while you are raging. That's one example. So just, like I said, I'm not going to go into all of the specifics in this video. Just know that when you see that concentrate trait, it does not mean that you can only keep one of those spells active at a time. It just means there's other abilities that might impose limitations on how they can function with concentrate abilities. If you want to know the rules for keeping spells active persistently from turn after turn, that's sustain is what you're going to look for. Another thing to talk about is going to be initiative. You are probably accustomed to initiative bonuses being based on dexterity. In Pathfinder, well, first of all, in Pathfinder, you can use pretty much any skill for your initiative. It comes down to what you were doing at the time the GM calls for initiative. So if you were keeping an eye out on a tree line, you're a druid, you're using the nature skill, you might notice a flock of birds come out of the bushes before goblins jump out to attack you. If you were scanning the area, you might be able to convince your GM to let you use your nature skill as your initiative score. Because in Pathfinder, it's not based on dexterity. It's not based on how fast you can draw your weapon. It's based on perception. It's based on how soon you can realize you're in danger. And so, rule of thumb, if there's something you are doing at the time initiative is called, you might be able to use that skill as your initiative score. Another example is you're a rogue. You're going to initiate combat by jumping on a chandelier, doing a backflip off of it. Well, you know what? If that's what you're doing to initiate combat, hey GM, can I roll my acrobatics skill as my initiative roll? If they're a cool GM, they'll probably say yes. Also, there are times in social encounters where you can use social skills to initiate combat. If you are in a social situation and you decide you're just going to throw a punch out of nowhere and punch somebody, you might use your deception skill as your initiative because they're not going to see that punch coming. So, long story short, in Pathfinder, any skill can be used as your initiative roll, provided that you were basically doing that thing at the time initiative was called for, and your GM agrees that that's allowable. Your default initiative is going to be your perception score. 1d20 plus your perception bonus is the default usual initiative roll, because again, it's not based on how fast you can pull your sword out, it's based on how quickly you can realize you're in danger. Something to know about action economy that is related to initiative is in Pathfinder, there are two ways you can modify your place in the initiative order. And that's through through delaying, and through readying. Um, in D&D 5e, you're used to being able to ready an action. That's nothing new, except that in Pathfinder, it takes two actions to ready. So on your turn, you're saying I'm going to spend these two actions, and I'm going to ready this action to perform later during somebody else's turn. But the key difference about initiative and Pathfinder is delay. You're never going to be penalized for rolling too well on initiative. You might win initiative, but say, you know what, I'd rather have my tanks get out in front of me before I act. But they rolled lower in the initiative. In Pathfinder, you can basically voluntarily lower your initiative score as low as you like. So you can drop down to an initiative score below your allies, let them go first, and then take your turn. So this is somewhat similar to what you're used to in 5e, where you might be first in the initiative order and use your readied action to say, I'm going to wait until my more tanky allies move first, and then as my readied action, I'm going to follow after them or do something like that. The key difference here is in 5e, a readied action is one singular action. You prepare to do that one action later in initiative as a result of something else. Whereas in Pathfinder, when you delay, you do change your place in the initiative order, and when that comes around, you get all three of your actions. You get to take your full turn then, and your place in the initiative order remains in that place going forward. So the next thing I want to talk about is a thing called secret checks that exist in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So, as the name implies, a secret check is a skill or something else that is rolled on the player's behalf by the GM in secret behind their screen. And so the GM rolls it for the players and does not necessarily tell them, it certainly does not tell them the numerical result, and may not even tell them if they succeeded or failed. So, this is for those situations where a character within the narrative would not have that knowledge. A typical example is any kind of a stealth check or a perception check. Those are rolled in secret by the GM. So if you're a person and you're exploring a dungeon and you come to a new room and you say, before I step in this room, I want to check it out. I'm going to roll perception to look around the room and see if I spot any danger. If that's not a secret roll, if you roll a 20 on the die and add your bonus, and the GM tells you, well, you don't spot any danger, you as a player know for certain there is no danger, because I rolled a natural 20 and I didn't spot anything. And by the same virtue, if you roll a natural 1, and the GM says, well, you don't find anything, well, you go, well, I didn't see anything, but, hey, Tim, why don't you check out the room too and see if you get a better roll? In reality, when we're doing perception checks, barring something, that would apply a penalty to that check, like concealment or a flash of light that blinds us or something like that, we don't know if we succeeded or failed on these checks. We don't know, in reality, did we roll a 1 or a 20 or a 10 or whatever. All we know is, do we see something or do we not? So that's where the secret checks come in. The GM rolls it in secret, adds your perception bonus to the roll, and just tells you if you saw something or if you didn't see something. But you as a player, you don't know how well you rolled on that die. You don't know if you critically succeeded or critically failed. You just know, I see something or I do not see something, and then you have to act on that information alone. Secret checks also come up in knowledge checks. If you're wanting to do a knowledge check you find an enemy monster, you want to do a knowledge check. Do I know what kind of monster this is? Do I know what its weaknesses are, or what have you? GM rolls that in secret. You don't know if you don't know how well or how poorly you did in most cases, unless the GM wants to tell you that. And the main reason for this is because if you critically fail this check, then the GM's going to give you false information. If you critically fail a knowledge check, then you remember things incorrectly, or you mistake one monster for another. If you rolled a natural on the table, then as a player, you know the information you're getting is bogus. So just be aware that secret checks exist in Pathfinder, and these will be called out. Any ability that has, again, these traits, know your traits, has the secret trait means the GM rolls it for you on your behalf in secret. Sense motive. There's no sense motive skill in Pathfinder 2nd edition, and there's no investigation skill either. Both sense motive and investigation are rolled into perception. So if you would like to investigate an area, or do what you are accustomed to being investigate, then that's just going to be a perception check. If you want to perform sense motive as you are accustomed to in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, that's just going to be a straight perception check in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Another thing that we should talk about is resting. So the concept of short and long rests doesn't exactly exist in Pathfinder the way you're accustomed to them existing. And the big point here is you do not get all of your hit points back on a long rest. So I believe in D&D 5th edition, long rest, you rest for 8 hours, you heal back to full. Pathfinder 2nd edition is not that forgiving, which I think to most Pathfinder player sensibilities, that's a good thing. Because to a lot of people, frankly, spending your day getting bruised and beaten and possibly cut by a weapon or set on fire by a fireball or a dragon's breath, to have all that damage just completely go away after a good night of sleep can rub a little bit against immersion for some people in the Pathfinder world. But long story short, what you need to know is you don't instantly heal everything back after a long rest, a night's rest. Instead, you're going to heal a number of hit points that are equal to your Constitution modifier times your level, with a minimum Constitution modifier of 1. So if you have a Constitution modifier of 2 and your 3rd level, a night's rest is going to heal 6 hit points. If you want to heal anything beyond that, you're going to need to either have healing spells cast on you, use certain magical items, or do what sort of replaces the hit dice healing on a short rest, which is the medicine skill. So instead of having a short rest where you roll your hit dice, you expend your hit dice to heal a little bit, you can have someone who's trained in the medicine skill use an ability called Treat Wounds to try to bandage you up and heal you to a certain degree. Also, something to know about is going to be flanking in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Flanking is not an optional rule. It is baked into the game. Flanking always occurs when you and an ally are on opposite sides or opposite corners of your enemy, and this can be pushed back a little bit if you have a reach weapon. So, especially if you're a rogue, always be looking for flanking, because flanking is going to impose the off-guard condition on your enemies, and that's what triggers a lot of what you might think of as flanking bonuses. Another things to be aware of in Pathfinder 2nd edition is the system of advantage and disadvantage doesn't entirely exist. It kind of exists, just is not as frequent. So you're used to things being simplified to where if you have advantage, you roll 2 dice, you take the higher. If you have disadvantage, you roll 2 dice, you take the lower. Instead, in Pathfinder 2nd edition, we have static bonuses and penalties that meet all of those times when you would normally roll advantage or disadvantage. If the GM believes that there are certain circumstances in which you would have advantage, instead of you rolling twice, your GM would likely tell you, well, I'm going to give you a +2 circumstance bonus to this roll. Now, the concept of rolling twice and taking the higher or taking the lower does exist in Pathfinder 2nd edition. These are called fortune effects. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because it's relatively rare that they come up. If you're playing a halfling, you might be able to get halfling luck that would allow you to do something similar to what you think of as advantage and disadvantage. Just long story short, just understand, as you understand, advantage and disadvantage in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition does not exist in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Instead, there are static modifiers and penalties that are applied to things. And if you believe that you should have advantage on an action because of your character's backstory, your history, the weather, lighting conditions, whatever it is, your GM is probably going to still give you a bonus to those moments. It's just not going to be advantage. It's just going to be like, hey, add 2 to your roll and give you a +2 circumstance bonus. And the last thing I want to leave all of you with is the number one question that I get asked by 5e players, which is, where's D&D Beyond for Pathfinder? What's the D&D Beyond of Pathfinder? And sadly, there's nothing that is quite as nice as D&D Beyond. I was about to say I love D&D Beyond. I used to love D&D Beyond. I loved it D&D Beyond back when you could do a la carte purchases and say, like, I just want to buy this one feat. I don't want to buy the whole book. I believe now they force you to buy the whole book, which Hasbro is lame, which is probably why you're here in the first place. But to answer the question, there is really no great one-to-one comparison of D&D Beyond to Pathfinder. The closest thing is going to be a website called Demiplane, where you can find Pathfinder Nexus that works very similar to D&D Beyond. In fact, I believe it's the company that's creating it. I might have this a little bit wrong, but I believe I've been told that a lot of their staff worked on D&D Beyond. But it's the same general idea. You buy digital versions of the books, and there's a character builder, and you can search for that stuff, but you have to buy the books digitally to use that platform on Demiplane or Pathfinder Nexus. If you're looking for a really solid character builder, I recommend Path Builder. Path Builder, 90% or maybe even 98% of it is free to use. And if there is a feature that you want to have, all you got to do is pay a one-time fee, and you unlock everything forever in perpetuity. And I think that was only a $5 flat charge when I did it. I don't know if his prices have gone up or what have you, but Path Builder is available on the internet, through Chrome or whatever your browser of choice is also available on Android devices. And I saw an announcement this very morning that he is working finally at getting Path Builder ported over to Apple devices on iOS as well. They're not there yet. But if you look for a good character builder, Path Builder is the recommendation. If you want full feature like D&D Beyond, check out Demiplane. Pathfinder Nexus is part of Demiplane. And if you want an online tool just to look up a rule, I find PF Easy tools to be the easiest for me to find what I'm looking for, but is sometimes not as complete as Archives of Nethys, which is the official repository online. So those two would be online resources for you to use. So that's it. I try to make this as brief as possible, although I know this is going to be one of my longer videos of key things you should know as a 5e player coming into Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remastered. If you have any questions, please leave those in the comments. If you're a 5e player and I goofed on anything, let me know, because I actually haven't DM'd 5e in a while. I do have a playlist of rule videos for Pathfinder 5th Edition, for Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition that you might find interesting still. I'll include those in the comments. But I may have tripped up on a particular two. Let me know. I would appreciate it. And as veteran Pathfinder players, if you have tips for all of our new friends coming in from Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, let them know in the comments as well. Let's be welcoming neighbors and invite them all into our happy little community. So, with that, I'm going to close out. As always, I want to take a moment to thank everybody who supports me in this channel, whether that's by clicking the like button, subscribing to the channel, subscribing to the Patreon, buying a super thanks. I really appreciate everything this community does to support me. And with that, thanks for watching. Take care and happy gaming.